Relative position chords built from notes outside the 7-note collection. In other words, from our Earth analogy, building chords from notes anchored in the 5 oceans. Ocean note chords, in other words. From our absolute relative numbering system, they would be designated with a 0.5 and are the Ionian Ocean point, that being 1.5, the Dorian Ocean 2.5, the Lydian Ocean 4.5, the Mixolydian Ocean, which would be 5.5, and finally the Aeolian Ocean 6.5. Now, what's the problem, you might ask, with our normal chord naming convention? There are a few of them which we will list out first and then go into in more detail. The problem with note-named chords includes note-based chord labels hide the song's modal perspective and key context. DAW's lead sheets often show stacked notes within a collection of 7-note context, and shifting names to accommodate outside notes forces a mental key change. So let's look at those. When we're thinking about the normal naming convention, what we do is we find the letter of the note and then we apply, say, one of these extensions. Now, the problem with that is it doesn't give us the context within the song because there's 12 notes that have letters attached to them. But from the perspective of our music playing, we're usually seeing it as a 7-note collection, not saying that we cannot go to the other 5 notes outside the collection, but we're usually looking at it from the perspective of there are 7 notes within the collection, 5 notes are outside of the collection. If we just name the chords by a note name and then an extension, it doesn't really give us the context relative to the 7-note collection that we are working in. For example, if you just look at all the extensions that are going to be typical for 3-note chords, 4-note chords, 5-note chords, 6-note chords, and 7-note chords from any point within a standard 7-note collection, this would be them. You can put them into buckets, meaning major bucket, minor bucket, dominant 7 bucket, diminished bucket. We've got the half diminished bucket, and then major extensions and minor extensions. However, this table doesn't really help you to know which of these extensions would be built from which of the 7 modal points. So that's going to be one of the issues that we have. And so, for example, if we look at this fretboard, which has the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top, and we're going to make a C major chord. Now, this collection of notes happens to be the collection of 7 notes that are in the C major. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that we're always working within a 12-note context, and there's going to always be 7-note collections as, in essence, our perspective. If we name those 7-note collections from the perspective of the major key, then there are only 12 collections of 7 notes. Now, that could be confusing because you might say, well, no, there's way more than that, because you could have the Dorian collection of notes and the Phrygian collection of notes and so on and so forth. But those are really just different names for the same collection of notes. You're just changing the tonic of the note. So the most efficient way to name the collections of notes is that we're going to name one from the standpoint of the major, one of 12 collections of notes, and then I'm going to tell you what the tonic is, what the center point is of that collection of notes, instead of saying that we have 12 times 7 collections of notes. Okay, so if we have this collection of notes, this would be the Ionian tab that we're on here, meaning it would be the C, which from a modal standpoint would be the Ionian. From an absolute numbering system, just numbering them 1 through 7, Ionian would be the 1, Dorian 2, Phrygian 3, Lydian 4, Mixolydian 5, Aeolian 6, and Locrian would be the 7. From a scale degree standpoint, you would have the 1, the 3, and the 5 building our major chord. We have a repeat of the 1 here. This would be from a caged system, like an A shape that is building a C chord. But what if I move that up to the C sharp? I want to build a chord that looks like this. It has that same Nashville number A shape, but I've moved up to this position. I could call it normal convention, a C sharp major. But notice when I call it a C sharp major, it doesn't really tell me, it's not indicating that this note is outside the collection of notes, because I'm visualizing my fretboard as though I'm in the collection of notes around C major, the 7-note collection. If I play this chord, then I have to say, how am I going to build that chord? Should I shift this whole collection of notes to give me the collection of notes around C sharp major, in which case this pattern would move up and I would have the same pattern and it would fit. Under normal naming conventions with scale degrees, that's what we have to do to kind of name the point from a scale degree standpoint. The 1, 3, 5 this would have to be the 1, 3, 5 in order to name that. That becomes part of the problem. And notice that in sheet music, back in the day in sheet music, they had a key signature that kind of gives you the sharps and flats, which gives you some indication of the collection of notes that you are in. But when we moved to tablature and even to a DAW system, we kind of lost that. There's no key signature. There's just the 12. You have the 12 notes. You might kind of highlight which notes are in the collection, but you don't really have that information. If you're looking at a song that's just in tablature, then I kind of have to guess which collection of notes I'm in, what's the tonic of that collection of notes, and if I play this chord outside the collection, I have to guess and know that that song doesn't belong in the collection through music theory, which isn't the most optimal way to do it. We should apply at least what we had in the old sheet music, telling people which collection of notes we're in, what's the tonic, and then indicate that this note chord is outside the collection, not a shift in the song to a new collection of notes. This one is being built off of the Dorian node at this point, but notice it has a note that's outside the collection, because if it's going to be the same major shape, that's not going to be normal for a Dorian chord, which has a minor third to it, typically in the normal shape. So again, we have a problem. If I go to the D sharp and have the same shape, I just move this same shape up. But if I'm in the same collection of notes, it's outside of the key. So if I call it a D sharp major, then again, I have to kind of know that these notes are outside the collection and then try to guess why the composer is doing that. If I move it to the Phrygian node, or the E and the collection of notes around the key of C, then it would be an E major, even though again, it has a note that's going to be outside the collection, because normally we would build a minor off of that node, that nodal point. And if I go to the F major, now it is a major, it fits because F is what I would call a Lydian shape, which has the same triad format. All right, and then if we go to F sharp, then we're outside the collection, and so on. So the proposal here, name everything by relative modal position, absolute Nashville style numbers. Now I'm using Nashville numbers. I don't want to get too technical on that, other than to say I'm just giving an absolute numbering system of 1 through 7, and I want it to be absolute, meaning if I play in a different mode, I'm going to keep this same numbering system because it's the same collection of notes, just then changing the tonic or the focal point or center of that collection of notes. So we keep 1 through 7 as the what I call continents in our Earth analogy, 7 continents, 5 oceans, and we insert 5 oceans, which would be the 0.5s, 1.5, 2.5, 4.5, and so on. So the chord equals the anchor position plus the shape, meaning I can name my chords within the perspective of the collection of notes by telling you what the anchor position is by the nodal point that I'm in, and then the shape of the chord. Is it, you could call it major or minor, but those aren't that specific, right? I can get all of the flavors of the shapes, even with more complex chords coming up to 7-note chords, by calling it by the normal modal chords. It's a 3-note or 4-note or 5-note or 6-note Ionian instead of major. It's a 3-note, 4-note, 5-note, 6-note, or 7-note Aeolian for minor. Or more specifically, if I'm adding a minor and I have that ninth, which has a major ninth, that would be a Dorian type chord. If I have a flat second in the chord construction, that would be a Phrygian type chord. If I have a Lydian, if I have an augmented fourth or 11th, that would be a Lydian chord. right? The diminished would be a Locrian chord. Flat 7 with a major chord would be a Mixolydian chord. So that gives me all the normal flavors. When we number the system, we number it by the notes that are in the collection. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I want to keep that numbering system the same, whether we're in the key of a major key or whether we're in a Dorian or an Aeolian or whatever, because then you have an absolute numbering system. Problem, however, the ocean notes. I need a number for the ocean notes. I need a name for them because they should still be available, but identified as outside the collection. So you have the Ionian and then what I would call Ionian plus or I plus, which would be 1.5, the Ionian Ocean. You have the Dorian, Dorian D, and then 2.5 would be what I would call the Dorian Ocean or the D plus. Then to 3, Phrygian. Then we have no Phrygian Ocean because there's no ocean between 3 and 4 when we apply our normal major scale calculation, whole, half from the perspective of the Ionian. And so then we have the Lydian, and then the Lydian Ocean 4.5, Lydian plus, which I'm labeling with a Y instead of an L, so it doesn't look like a 1. And then we've got the 5, which is Mixolydian, and then we've got 5.5, which is Mixolydian Ocean or Mixolydian plus, which I'm labeling with an X instead of an M, so it doesn't get major or minor confused. 6 is Aeolian, and then 6.5, Aeolian Ocean or A plus, and then 7, which is Locrian, which I'm saying is an N, so that we don't have 2 L's and so on. So that's going to be the idea. So then, if I look at this shape again, I have the low or heavy E string on top. We're in the collection of notes around the key of C here, and let's say we move up to this position right here. If I still call that a C major, when I build that chord, normally I have to move the entire shape up in my mind. This is what confuses a lot of people. They're going to say, oh, I have to make that the 1 so I can say 1, 3, 5 and build my A shape. Or you might know the A shape, but again, you're still kind of thinking that the whole thing is moving up in order to accommodate this chord, which isn't indicated by the name that it should be outside the shape. Now, there's 2 things that could have happened if I'm playing in the collection of notes around the key of C, 7-note collection, and then I make this chord. One is that maybe I did change the collection of notes. Maybe I now am in the collection of notes of C sharp, and the song has changed its collection of notes. If that is the case, like with the sheet music back in the day, we would like to give a different key signature. I'd like to tell you that I've switched the collection of notes, and now we have an Ionian, a Phrygian, and a 135, and a Mixolydian, right? But more likely, we didn't switch the collection of notes. I'm using this one that's in the ocean for a particular purpose, possibly as a lead-in to the Dorian. Maybe I'm just doing that as a pass-through chord to get to then the Dorian or something like that. I'd rather indicate that by saying, not naming it by the C, but name it by relative position. It's the it's the Ionian Ocean, it's the I plus, it's the Ionian Ocean, or it's the 1.5 chord, which you could say then has a major shape if you want to, but that's still going to be somewhat restricted. I'd rather say it's an Ionian Ocean chord, which has an Ionian shape to it. So, and if I want to be more specific on a number of notes, I'd like to say it's a 3-note chord in this case, or a 4-note chord, or a 5-note chord if it was more complex, which is in the Ionian Ocean, I plus, and it happens to have an Ionian shape, which is the major shape. If I'm building from a chord that's outside the collection, I could use any shape. Maybe it's going to be a major or minor, Ionian, Aeolian, or maybe it's Dorian, maybe it's Phrygian, or whatever. Maybe it's a diminished that I'm building from this shape. That would give you the context within the song and the shape much more clearly. If I'm on this note, notice here, if I'm using the same collection of notes, then I'm building off of the Dorian, but I made a major shape to it. If I call it a D major, people that are reading it are going to say, maybe that is something that fits in the song. In this case, the point I'm on fits, but I still have a note that's outside the collection. So it would be nice to just call it a 3-note Dorian chord / Ionian shape. So now I'm saying, look, I'm building off of this Dorian node, but it doesn't have the standard Dorian shape because it has an Ionian shape, right? That would be more specific to tell someone, look, normally if you're building off of the Dorian, it's going to have a minor shape. It's going to have a Dorian shape. But no, we had a major shape. So I can say I'm building off of that node, but for whatever reason, I'm going to give it a major shape. That would be more specific, giving you more information about the context. Otherwise, maybe I shifted the whole song up to this node, in which case now I have a different collection of notes. That D is now the 1. It's the Ionian. Now I have the same relative position, which is what we typically have to do in order to call it the 1, 4, 5 to build the chord, but isn't actually what's actually happening in the context of the song unless you're changing the collection of notes. Because normally we're not changing the collection of notes. I'm now building off of what I would call the 2, the Dorian, and so I don't want to mess the. So if I moved it up to here, we would be in that would be a D sharp major. So again, if I switch the collection of notes under normal naming, I'd have to rename it here. That's the 1, 3, 5. But it would be easier to say, look, this is a 3-note Dorian ocean or a 2.5 chord, but it has an Ionian shape to it. From a structural standpoint, my fingers know the shape of an Ionian shape, which is a major shape. You could call it a major or minor, but Ionian would be more specific. And then I know the context. I know that this is in the ocean. I know that I'm playing something weird from the perspective of the song. And then this one's on the E major. So now I'm on the E, but normally that's the Phrygian node if I'm in the same collection of notes. So I'd rather call it, look, this is a 3-note off of the Phrygian, but it has an Ionian shape or a major shape if you would rather, right? Instead of saying, no, the collection of notes has changed, in which case now it's the 1, 3, 5 because I have a new collection of notes. Normally, no, I don't have a new collection of notes. I want to tell people I'm building off of the Phrygian node, but for whatever reason, it has an Ionian shape to it, a major shape to it. That gives you context. This one's on the F. Notice this, you could call that an F major, but even there, I'd rather call it a 3-note Lydian, unless you're changing the collection of notes, because calling it a Lydian tells you where you are in the collection of notes. If I call it a major, I'm going to kind of assume the default is it's the Ionian, which when we build the collection of notes, we still have to do, because you usually make that the 1, and you kind of assume or trick your mind to feel like it's the Ionian to build the chord. It would be better in the context of the song, say, no, it's a Lydian chord, which has the same shape as the Ionian, but if I build extensions, more notes into that, it's going to have a different shape when I get to the 11th because of the augmented 11th. And then finally, we have the Lydian ocean, where once again, I'd rather say it's a 3-note Lydian ocean. I should have put Ionian shape next to it. Why it's better, the transferable by design. So one point of this is, if you're on the piano, you probably have the experience of getting locked into just playing in one collection of notes. You can't transfer it, in part because the piano doesn't have even notes, which is why you list out these sharps and flats, because the keys have different sizes. That's not the case on other instruments, but the same concept that locks you in is also theoretical, because you're memorizing the letters that are in a particular key, particularly the key of C, because they don't have any sharps and flats. But if you memorize the relative positions, it's totally transferable. You can write your entire music with relative positions. The chords become a barrier to that because the chords are typically built off of the note names, which restricts you from writing in such a way that everything is completely transposable without having to do anything, right? So you'd rather write the chords in a way that you can transpose everything. So you have the same labels across all 12 collections of notes. There are only 12 collections of notes in Western music, so that's all of them. Fretboard first, shapes stay stable while anchors move. So it's clearer DAW, MIDI, metadata, relative points are portable and searchable. So in other words, here's another idea of the fretboard, or another look at it. If we think about this as the planet, we have the continents, we've got the oceans, right? And we're trying to use our relative position standpoint and say, am I going to name this? This is the collection of notes around the A, the key of A major, But I'd rather, once I know the collection, look at the pattern, naming the relative position of the pattern, which is, this is Ionian or 1, and you can see up here, this is Aeolian or 6 in this case. Then if I move here, now this, I'm in a different collection of notes, which is now A sharp, right? That would be like the world is spinning. The grid is still on top of the world, but I want to go down to the planet and label on the planet. I don't want to label on the grid that is hovered over the planet, right? Because that's going to be more complicated. If I go down to the actual planet, I want to say where am I in the context of the planet, right? So in this case, I would be on this node. So this Ionian to Aeolian would be here once I know where the shapes line up. So now we're in the collection of notes of B, but I don't want to name it as the B and memorize all these notes in B, partly because the sharps and flats are a mess, but I'd rather name the relative positions. I can see the position Ionian to Aeolian is the same. All the relative positions are the same, and naming them 1 through 7 plus the 5 ocean notes. So now we're in the collection of notes around the key of C, but I want to name them by relative position, Ionian to Aeolian. Here's the collection of notes around C sharp, naming them now Ionian to Aeolian. Here's the collection of notes for the D, Ionian to Aeolian here. Collection of notes for D sharp. Here's the Ionian to Aeolian here. Collection of notes for E, Ionian to Aeolian here. So same shape, you can see moving across the fretboard. We want to name it by those relative positions, similarly to not naming the planet here by a grid that's hovering over the planet in space. We're not trying to shoot the Earth with a laser. We're trying to put our finger on the actual Earth. So I want to know the relative position from the perspective of touching the planet so that I can move around from that perspective once I know the collection of notes that I'm in. So ocean chords outside the 7. So anchor, add an ocean note. So the problem with this perspective, by the way, is that when I name these chords, like if I name a normal chord that's in the collection 1 through 7, I can just name it by saying it's a 3-note Ionian, it's a 4-note Ionian, it's a 5-note Ionian, a 6-note Ionian, and you just take every other what I call modal half step to build the chord. So it would be going 1, 3, 5. If it's a Dorian, it's a 1-note Dorian, a 2-note Dorian, a 3-note Dorian, no problem. Where does the problem happen? Problem happens when I build a chord off of one of the 5 notes outside the collection, what we're calling ocean notes, designated with a 0.5. If I do that, then we could still do it. We just designate it a 1.5 chord note, right? It's a 1.5 absolute nodal numbering system note. But we also have to give it the shape then, which we could call major or minor, but would be more specific if we gave it Ionian, Aeolian, Dorian, Phrygian, because that gives us all the normal flavors that we can build. So we want to know that and the number of notes, meaning if I don't tell you the number of notes, it would be a 3-note triad. But if I want to add the 7 from a scale degree standpoint, then I would say it's a 4-note chord, right? Or it's a 5-note chord, or it's a 6-note chord. That will give you the shape that will be standard, that we can clearly move up and not have to rename everything. So name is going to be the anchor and then the shape. So it's a 1.5, and then you can say it's a Dorian, or it's a Ionian plus a Mixolydian. If needed, specify the triad 7-note size. So in other words, the number of notes that we have involved. So construction rule, standard chord logic. So from the anchor, take every other modal half step for the chord tones. How do you build a chord? You basically take whatever absolute nodal number that we are on. If it's a Dorian, you start on the 2, and then you take every other note in the collection of notes, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6. So it would be Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian. Those would be the actual absolute modal points that you hold down to build the chord. So for ocean anchors, internal looked uses half steps. Now the problem with the ocean chords is that it gets a little bit messy because we can't use the measuring system of modal half steps. We have to use the shape, which is what we would typically do in context. still describe the shape by modal family, Ionian, Lydian, and so on and so forth. So in other words, this is the Lydian point specifically. So let's say we're in the Lydian Ocean, which would be 4.5 from our absolute nodal numbering system. Now, if I built a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 note chord, normally we would take the note in the collection of notes around the key of C. That would be an F sharp or G flat. And then we would call it by note and then say it's a major 13 if it was a 7 note chord. And it would be an F sharp or G flat minor 13, or we can build an F sharp B flat minor 13, minor flat 13, flat 9. That would be like if we're building an Ionian, and this would be a Dorian, this would be a Phrygian, a Lydian, a Mixolydian, and an Aeolian. But by doing that, again, we don't give the context of whether that chord actually fits in the 7-note collection or not. So it would be nicer if we're just making 7-note chords to make it as complex as possible rather than a 3-note triad to name it, look, it's a 7-note Lydian plus with an Ionian shape. Or it could be a 7-note Lydian plus Lydian Ocean or Nashville number or absolute number 4.5, but it has a Dorian or absolute modal number 2 shape. It could be a 7-note Lydian plus or Lydian Ocean 4.5 absolute number with a Phrygian shape, or that would be a 2 shape. It could be a 7-note Lydian Ocean with a Lydian shape, a 7-note Lydian Ocean with a mixed Lydian shape. Now it could be a 3-note, 4-note, 5-note, 6-note, or 7. 7's just the most complicated one. So that's great, but the one thing that's a little bit more messy is that we can't really define the modal points as easily. Why? Because normally, under normal scale degrees, I would make this point the 1, so that I would name everything as relative scale positions 1, 3, 5, 7 in order to build the chord. But to do that, you have to shift your perspective, visualizing the fretboard as though you're in a different collection of notes. What I'd rather do normally is to use modal half steps, meaning if we were on one of the 7 notes in the collection, then I'm just going to measure from that nodal point, meaning I start on that nodal point and then I go 2 modal half steps, 4 modal half steps, and then 6 modal half steps, meaning if I'm on the Lydian, which is a 4, I say 4, 5, 6, which is going to be an Aeolian node, 6, 7, 1, around the horn to 1, which would be an Ionian node. And you can build your chord that way, easy to do without having to renumber everything or visualize the system as a different collection of notes. But if you're building from a note that's in the ocean, then I can't really count up the modal half steps because by definition, I'm starting from something that's outside that collection. So I have to use half-step terminology to kind of do that. We have an example to kind of show you that. But once you do that, you could still name like a 3-note triad, which would be a 7-note Lydian Ocean chord with an Ionian shape, would have the points of Lydian Ocean, Aeolian Ocean, and Ionian Ocean. If you memorize that, you don't have to, but because you know it by shape. But if you did, it would be better or more worthwhile to do than to memorize the actual notes that would be building up, say, an F sharp or G flat major. Why? Because this would be the same for all of the Lydian Ocean Ionian shaped chords. It would be the same for all 12 collections of notes for that point built off of that Lydian Ocean. Whereas it would be different if you use note points for all collections of notes. All right. So so always declare the active 7-note collection. So I think it would be the most specific way to be naming the information that you're doing is not to say I'm going to name the collection of notes from the perspective of 7 times 12 different collections of notes, because I could name each of the only 12 collections of notes from each of the 7 perspectives, the modal perspectives. It would be better to have a convention to say, look, there's only 12 collections of 7 notes. Name them from the standpoint of the major key because that's the convention, and then name the tonic. That way, That way you only go there there's only 12 crayon boxes that you're going to give an absolute name to, instead of naming each of those 12 crayon boxes by 7 different names, right? And so that's going to be, I think, would be a more standard convention, which would be a lot easier to teach people that don't know music theory, particularly if they're using like a DAW, and all you have to tell them is, look, choose one of the 12 collections of 7 notes and then choose your modal center. Which of those 7 collections of notes is your tonic? Instead of saying, well, you could have 7 times 12 collections of notes depending on what your center point is, and then we rename that collection of notes by the one of, right now. See how much cleaner it would be if you so only change the declared collection when the music truly modulates. So in other words, if a song, most songs are just from the perspective of one collection of notes. If I'm playing in the collection of notes around the key of C, then usually the whole song is going to be relative to that collection of notes. Not saying that we don't pick up chords, for example, like this one that's outside the collection, but I'm still looking at this chord as though it is outside the collection from the perspective of playing in this collection of notes. It's more common to change the modal perspective, meaning I'm in the Ionian perspective, and then I'm going to change to the Aeolian, meaning the Aeolian for a particular part of the song is what I'm thinking as the center or tonal center of that song, right? That would be useful to tell the reader, but notice if I go from Ionian to Aeolian, I don't really have to tell them anything if I keep the numbering system the same. Whether I look at it from the Aeolian perspective or the Ionian perspective, the Aeolian is still going to be the 6th absolute number, then it's the same collection of notes. I'm just now thinking about this as the tonic. That still might be useful from a DAW system because you might want it as the lowest note in like your local collection of note. We'll talk about that later, but it's the same numbering system in general. Whereas if I switched the entire collection of notes, moving from the collection of notes around the key of C to the collection of notes around the C sharp, then I would want to tell the system, look, I'm viewing the song differently now. You should move this entire collection of notes up. That's important information for the context of the song. That's kind of like what we used to do in sheet music that kind of got lost with the key signatures as we moved into the DAW. The DAW just gives you all the notes. It doesn't really tell you this part of the song, I'm seeing it from the perspective of a C major. This part of the song, I'm now seeing it from the perspective of the collection of notes of C sharp major, right? So we would want to, it would be better to distinguish that. You shouldn't have to guess that that's the case. So mark ocean events explicitly instead of silently renaming notes. So the contents of an ocean. So the collection of notes, if we put them into a circle to think of them as an absolute position, then we have 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. There's no 0.5 between 3 and 4 because we're using the standard convention from the perspective of the Ionian, having a formula of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step. So you get a 1 Ionian ocean. 1 is the Ionian, 1.5 Ionian ocean, 2 is the Dorian, 2.5 Dorian ocean, 3 is the Phrygian, and then it goes directly to 4, no ocean between 3 and 4, and then 4 goes to the 4.5 Lydian ocean, and then Mixolydian, 5, 5.5 Mixolydian ocean, 6 Aeolian, 6.5 Aeolian ocean, and then that goes to 7 Locrian, no Locrian ocean, that goes around the horn back to the map to where we started, the Ionian. Okay, so naming conventions fast. So anchor. So the anchor is going to be 1 through 7 for the continents, the normal naming convention, and then you just name the number of notes that are in the chord, and it's easy to figure out the chord because you just take the modal half steps. But if you're in the ocean, then you have to use a naming convention of the 1.5, 2.5, and so on, which you could also use I plus, D plus, Y plus, X plus, A plus for the oceans near the Ionian, Dorian, Lydian, Mixolydian, and Aeolian. So the shape modal family. So in other words, if in particular you're on the Ionian Ocean or any of the oceans, then you can name it by saying this is the note I'm on and this is the shape of the chord, named either major or minor, but more specifically by the Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian. That gives you more flavors when you have more complex chords past simply triads. Now, you can also use that same convention if you're on 1 through 7, meaning if I'm playing off of a Dorian, I would normally build a Dorian chord, a 3-note Dorian, a 4-note Dorian, a 5-note Dorian, a 6-note Dorian, or a 7-note Dorian, but maybe I want to build a major chord off of the Dorian node. There's a couple ways you can name that. I could explain it that for whatever reason you're going to put in a major third instead of a minor third, but you could just do the same thing. Look, I'm playing off of the 2-note, I'm playing off of Dorian, but I'm going to use an Ionian or major shape. So that would give you more flavors from a shape standpoint to easily name what you're doing from that perspective. I'm playing the Dorian, which normally has a minor shape or a Dorian shape, but I'm giving it a major shape to it. So that is right. So then example, so the Ionian Ocean, so we're in the Ionian Ocean, 3-note Ionian Ocean with an Ionian shape. This is a 3-note Ionian Ocean that has an Aeolian shape, which is a minor shape. You could call this a 3-note 1.5 chord if you want, with a 1 shape, right? Absolute number system 1 or Ionian shape or a major shape. You could call this a 3-note Ionian Ocean or a 3-note 1.5 absolute modal number system with a absolute modal number 6 shape or Aeolian shape, or in other words, a minor shape. All right, and then this is going to be fretboard view. So keep the continent map fixed, move your anchor. So apply the formula caged silhouette as shapes over any anchor, including ocean. Musically, memory becomes transposable logic. In other words, similar analogy here. Remember that this is our fretboard up top that you can imagine is hovering over the earth. The earth is spinning. So that means that I don't want to name everything by the fretboard that's hovering over the earth. I want to actually define the earth in what degree of rotation it is in, go down to the earth, put my finger on the earth, and then see things from the perspective of the earth. In other words, this shape, for example, is underneath the fretboards, you can imagine, as the world turns. If I name this shape, if I name this going from this A to this shape up here, which is the F sharp, then that's not as effective if I was to say this is continent Nashville number 1, right? Because if I move it up here, now this relationship stayed the same. The continents stayed the same, but if I use the fretboard shape above it, then now I have a different name for the same continent. If I name this continent underneath it, the whole continent is like North America or something. The whole continent, as the world turns, is shifting under the grid on top of it. I want to see the continent once I put my fingers on the continent and then map from the perspective of the continent, not the fretboard hovering over it. So here it is moving underneath the fretboard, right? That's going to be the general gist of it.